Hello everyone, I'm JG and welcome back to MusicForever, where today I'm going to be reviewing the newest album from Beck, Hyperspace. This is a project that I was kind of interested to see what direction that it was going to move in, because with Beck, he's not an artist that stays in one particular sound or style for too long. He constantly changes up his style, his sound, what genre he's playing around with from album to album. And on his last project, Colors, he was playing around with a more straightforward pop sound. And I know a lot of people didn't really care for that record, but for me personally, I thought it was a decent project. Not one of Beck's best by any means, but it was still a pretty solid, straightforward pop record that, had some catchy tracks on it. I feel like the instrumentals to that project were pretty decent too. Again, not a project I was blown away by necessarily, but I like it a fair bit more than most people do. Coming into this new project here, Hyperspace, it seems like in some ways Beck is kind of continuing some of the ideas that were present on Colors, particularly in the regard that this record once again sees Beck playing around with some poppier elements, some more modern sounds too. However, this record at the same time moves in a very different direction than what Colors was doing. Whereas that record was very straightforward and catchy, this record's more spacious, it's more atmospheric. I feel like it's more vibe focused as well. They're just two really different breeds of album, and for the most part, I think I still certainly prefer Colors to this project. Overall, this new album here really isn't clicking with me much at all. The idea behind this record, sonically speaking, isn't one that I think is bad, or I don't think it's one that Beck would be incapable of pulling off, but here on this record, it's just not executed well enough to make for an interesting album. My biggest problem with this thing is that it's just way too boring and uninteresting to really hold my attention for its entire runtime. This thing feels like one of the lengthiest listens I had this year, which really shouldn't be the case given that this thing just runs a little under 40 minutes in length. It's not a particularly long album, but it feels so much longer just because it seems like so little is going on in this album's runtime. There are some moments on this thing where it seems like Beck kind of gets things together a bit more, and there are some moments here that are a bit more interesting, but these are few and far between on this album as a whole. And even when these moments do pop up, they're still not quite as good as even some of the best moments that were on Colors. The track Uneventful Days, I feel like, is one of the stronger moments on this project, probably one of my favorite songs on this thing. I feel like the vibe-focused atmosphere of this song, mixed with some of the more modern sounds, is pulled off its best here on the record on this track. I think the instrumental to the song is one of the stronger ones as a whole, and I feel like Beck's vocal performance here on the track is one of the more engaging as well. The hook to this track is also one of the more memorable ones, which is another thing that is sorely lacking here on this record, is that's, memorable hooks. But this track's hook is pretty decent in my opinion. Again, this isn't one of the best Beck songs ever or anything like that. It's still a pretty mediocre one, all things considered, but I think it's one of the high points on this record still. I also think that the track See Through is one of the stronger ones on this thing, again, primarily because I think the hook to this track works a lot better than a lot of the other hooks across this project. I still wouldn't say that this track is super memorable or interesting or anything. It's just a fair bit stronger than some of the other cuts on this record. And when it comes to a lot of the other songs on this project, like I said before, they're pretty unmemorable, pretty uninteresting. The instrumentals to these tracks go for this very spacey, vibe-focused sound. They pull in elements of synths, they pull in electronic elements, they pull in rock elements too. You'll have some trap hi-hats mixed into this thing as well. It's a big mix-up of different sounds really that you get here, but it is pretty uniform across this project. Sure, there are some cuts on here that maybe have a more rock-focused sound to them with some more prominent guitars. There are some cuts on here that have a more prominent synth sound to them. But at the same time, I feel like this record as a whole is pretty consistent sounding, which I guess is a good thing, but it's kind of to the point where this whole thing just kind of starts to blur together into one big experience, and not really in a good way. The instrumental mixture of sounds here could work. I mean, if there's anyone that could pull it off, I could see Beck being one of those people to do it, but it just doesn't end up being super interesting, I guess. None of the instrumentals here really stand out as being super memorable or exciting. The mixture of sounds is never super engaging or anything, even though there's a lot going on in them at times. Furthermore, Beck's vocal performance on a lot of these tracks is pretty decent, I guess, but I wouldn't call it great most of the time either. There's just very little memorable moments coming from Beck on this project. Like I said, there are a couple of cuts on here that have some more memorable hooks, but even these cuts, their hooks are only more memorable really in the context of this record as a whole. The rest of the songs on this thing are just so lifeless and sleepy that any moment on this record where there's something that kind of jumps out to me as being memorable or catchy is a moment that I kind of treasure when listening to this thing as a whole experience. So yeah, overall Beck singing on this thing is pretty passable. I wouldn't say there's many moments that stand out as being super great, and there are some moments that are kind of odd and awkward too, like some of his flows on the title track on this thing just feel kind of odd and choppy. Also on the track Chemical, one of the flows that he pulled out on this track feels kind of reminiscent of one of the flows on the Frank Ocean track Biking that Frank has on that song. I don't know if I'm the only one thinking this. Maybe it's a really weird connection for me to make, because that song that's been released for a couple years now has absolutely nothing to do with this project. But the first time I was listening through Chemical and Beck kind of goes into that flow about halfway through the track, I believe it was, that's the first thing that my mind jumped to. Maybe I'm the only one who thought that, but it just feels weirdly reminiscent of a completely different song that has nothing to do with this one. And I found that to be kind of odd, I guess, kind of strange. But for the most part, Beck's performances on this thing just aren't super memorable. The lyrics across this project aren't super engaging either. I wouldn't say the majority of them are super terrible or anything like that, but for the most part, they're just kind of there. Like, they're fine enough, I guess, but they're just not super interesting or anything either. It's just another aspect of this record that's just kind of bland overall. One of the tracks on this thing that kind of stands out in a sort of odd way is actually the lead single from this thing, Saw Lightning, a track that when I initially reviewed it, I was kind of lukewarm towards it. I just didn't think it was super good or bad or anything, but the more I listened to it, especially in the context of this record, the more it just, I kind of grow to dislike it more and more. For one thing, it just doesn't really blend in with the sound of the rest of this project. It's really the only song on here that's really upbeat, kind of danceable, just really wild sounding. Once again, you have a lot of different styles and sounds mixed into this thing, but in a completely different way than the other tracks on this record are. It almost sounds like a track coming out of a completely different recording session or writing session of songs. It just doesn't fit in with the rest of this record, I feel. It just is out of place on the record. There are some elements it shares with some of the other songs on this thing, but it still feels kind of odd and different in a way that it feels like a weird moment on this record where it just kind of goes off on a tangent, but it never really comes back to it either. And as for the track itself, I just find it kind of annoying in some senses. The hook on this thing, kind of annoying. It is one of the catchier ones on this project, which would be something I enjoy, but the annoying factor kind of gets in the way of me enjoying that at the same time. It's just not a song that does a ton for me personally. The instrumental still isn't super interesting. The lyrics here on this track are some of the worst on the entire project. It's just not a track I care for particularly. One of the worst on the record overall, honestly. Another kind of odd moment on this record is actually the opening track to this thing, Hyper Life, which really isn't much of a full song. It's just kind of this short introduction to the record that stylistically is really similar to the title track that comes later on. I can see what it was going for, kind of like starting up this sound at the beginning of the record and then calling back to it later on with the full-length title track, especially, you know, since the titles of the tracks are so similar. But I don't know, this intro just does very little, and it's just not very interesting at all, even more so when compared to a lot of the other tracks on this record, which aren't very interesting to begin with. It just feels like a minute and a half or so that's completely unnecessary on this record, and I think the album would have been a bit more concise and to the point if it was cut, because like I said, this record already feels a bit bloated and overlong as it is, even if it's really not that long of an album, as I also mentioned previously. So overall, Hyperspace really isn't a record that did a ton for me personally. Like I said, there are a couple of moments on this project that I think are decent. You have some ideas spread out across this thing that are also kind of interesting, but for the most part, it just never comes together completely to make an interesting album experience. Throughout this album's runtime, I just found myself really bored and uninterested, and it just felt like it was going on forever, even though this thing is only like 40 minutes or so in length. It's not a very long album, as I said multiple times already. I could see this style working for Beck Maybe if he tweaked a couple of things here or there, if he made some of the instrumentals just a bit more vibrant, a bit more interesting, a bit more lively maybe, and if his vocal performances on these tracks were maybe just a bit more vibrant as well. But with how this record ends up going on about, it's just really boring, I guess. There's no other word to really describe it concisely other than boring, at least for me. Again, I don't mind when Beck does poppy music. Like I said, I really enjoyed Colors to some extent, even though a lot of other people didn't really care for that project. But the difference between that album and this one is that that album at least was pretty catchy and to the point with its songwriting. There are tracks on that record that I think are pretty memorable because they're catchy. It's just a kind of fun album. Again, not an album I think is great or anything, but there certainly has a lot more going for it than this one. Overall, if you're a hardcore fan of Beck's, this album is worth giving a single listen to at the very least, just because he changes his sound and his style up so much that you're never going to really know if you like a particular album of his until you listen to it. But if you don't fall into that particular group of people, I wouldn't really recommend this project. I just did not find it super interesting personally, but that is just my own personal opinion on this project. If you happen to disagree, that's perfectly fine. In fact, feel free to leave your own thoughts on this album in the comment section down below. And while you're down there, make sure you also leave a like on the video and subscribe to the channel for more music-related content, things like album reviews, track reviews, things of that sort. Once again, thank you for watching, and stay golden.